On the 60th floor of a luxury apartment building, there is no alarm bell ringing. There is no dramatic explosion of shattering glass echoing through the empty hallways. There is no sudden structural collapse making headline news around the world. Instead, the first sign of a massive financial crisis begins with absolute silence. It begins with a single drop of water slowly sliding down the inside of a pristine living room window. A hand reaches out with a cloth and wipes the moisture away. The water disappears instantly, leaving the glass looking perfect once again. The quiet hum of the air conditioning continues its steady rhythm in the background. The owner goes back to sleep thinking nothing of this tiny event. But that single drop of water is a microscopic warning sign of a systemic inevitability. This is not a story about towers that are physically about to fall down. The truth hiding behind the skyline is far more uncomfortable and far more expensive. These towers do not need to fall to trap their owners in an inescapable financial nightmare. They only need to grow old. When the materials holding the building together begin to age, a quiet clock starts ticking. The question is no longer about whether the building is safe today. The real question is, who exactly will be forced to pay the invoice tomorrow? What happens when the damage extends beyond the boundaries of a single apartment? What happens when the reserve fund is utterly drained? And what happens when an engineering problem suddenly transforms into a devastating legal obligation? To understand the invisible trap, we must first look at what is being sold. Dubai presents the world with a skyline built on the promise of eternal youth. The marketing brochures feature endless walls of reflective glass standing tall against the desert sun. Buyers are captivated by the illusion of a flawless and passive investment. They purchase the height of the tower. They purchase the spectacular and uninterrupted views of the ocean and the city. They purchase the prestige of owning a piece of a modern architectural miracle. But they rarely understand the physical reality of what wraps around their new asset. The beautiful exterior of these modern skyscrapers is known in the construction industry as a curtain wall. A curtain wall is essentially a lightweight outer skin hung upon the main concrete framework. It does not carry the structural weight of the building itself. Instead, its only job is to protect the interior from the harsh external environment. This outer skin is a complex assembly of specialized components. It is constructed from heavy glass panels and rigid aluminum frames. It is held together by synthetic rubber gaskets and specialized silicone sealants. It relies on a vast network of hidden joints and mechanical anchors. It includes intricate drainage channels and pressure equalization chambers. In simple terms, the glass and the metal frames act as the hard structural bones of the exterior. The synthetic gaskets and the silicone sealants act as the soft, flexible joints. To the human eye from street level, the building appears perfectly motionless, but that is merely an optical illusion born of scale. The skin of the tower is in a state of constant motion every single day. It expands under the extreme heat of the desert afternoon. It contracts during the cooler hours of the night. It sways and flexes against the powerful forces of the coastal wind. A massive structure, stretching hundreds of meters into the sky, relies entirely on these tiny, flexible connections. These tiny joints must absorb every millimeter of movement while remaining completely airtight. These are the spaces that never appear in the glossy marketing materials. But these microscopic spaces are exactly where the true financial burden of the building is hiding. When people think of a damaged building, they imagine cracked foundations or shattered windows. But the most vulnerable parts of a high-altitude glass tower are not the glass panels themselves. The inevitable failure almost always begins at the invisible borders. It begins within the complex science of environmental degradation. The materials used to seal these buildings are locked in a daily battle against brutal natural forces. The first invisible enemy is thermal movement. Metal framing expands and contracts significantly as the temperature shifts throughout the day. The sealants filling the gaps must stretch and compress repeatedly without losing their grip on the aluminum. The second invisible enemy is ultraviolet radiation from the relentless desert sun. Over many years, UV rays slowly break down the chemical bonds inside synthetic polymers. The soft and highly elastic silicone gradually begins to harden and turn brittle. The third enemy is the abrasive desert sand blowing against the facade. Fine particulate matter works its way into microscopic crevices and grinds against the rubber gaskets. Eventually, these flexible joints lose their ability to recover their original shape. They begin to pull away from the metal and the glass. This microscopic separation is all that the ambient humidity needs to find an entry point. Modern skyscrapers use double-glazed insulated window units to keep the heat out. These units contain 2 panes of glass separated by a sealed space filled with argon gas. When the edge seal of this unit degrades, the insulating gas slowly escapes. External moisture is then drawn into the space between the glass panes. This creates a permanent foggy discoloration that cannot be cleaned from the inside or the outside. You can easily recognize a broken window because the damage is sudden and obvious. But it is incredibly difficult to recognize a hardened strip of weather sealant. A resident might hear a faint whistling sound when the wind blows against the building. They might feel a tiny draft of warm air entering near the floorboards. These are the quiet symptoms of a protective skin that is reaching the end of its natural lifespan. The building is slowly losing its ability to fight off the elements. And while the replacement materials themselves might seem cheap, the real problem is location. How exactly do you replace a $50 strip of rubber when it is located 200 meters in the air? The moment an exterior flaw is discovered, the cost of repair multiplies exponentially. The true expense does not come from buying a tube of fresh silicone sealant. The true expense comes from the extreme logistics of high-altitude access. Replacing components on the face of a skyscraper requires a highly specialized operation. First, the building management must commission comprehensive structural surveys. Engineers must conduct acoustic and water penetration testing to find the exact source of the failure. Once the scope of work is defined, the building must deploy its heavy maintenance equipment. Workers must use mechanical gondolas or customized building maintenance units. These mechanical platforms must be carefully lowered down the side of the towering structure. Working at such extreme heights requires specialized labor forces with advanced safety certifications. The ground level below the work zone must be completely barricaded to protect pedestrians from falling debris. Sometimes heavy machinery or specialized cranes must be brought in to remove large glass panels. Technical supervisors must monitor every step of the installation process. Following the repair, independent inspectors must verify that the new seals are perfectly watertight. This entire operation creates massive logistical disruptions for the residents and the management. This complex reality gives birth to a dangerous financial concept known as maintenance debt. Maintenance debt is created when necessary repairs are postponed to a later date. The building management saves money today by ignoring the hardening rubber and the failing silicone. But the physical degradation of the building does not pause just because the budget is tight. Failure to inspect the facade early means the management does not understand the full scope of the aging process. A small gap in the weather seal allows water to reach the internal metal anchors. Water causes those hidden mechanical anchors to slowly corrode and lose their strength. What could have been a simple joint replacement evolves into a major structural intervention. The required scope of work expands drastically, and the cost of access skyrockets. The initial budget projections become entirely meaningless in the face of compounded damage. Property marketers sell buyers the dream of an infinite horizon, but the bill for maintaining that dream is calculated by the square meter. A single damaged joint on the 60th floor is never just an isolated incident. It is a vertical timeline of aging materials stretching across dozens of floors. When the problem escalates from a single tube of sealant to a full facade restoration, it becomes a question of money. Where exactly is the cash going to come from to fix a system that is quietly failing? To find the money, we must leave the windy heights of the glass facade. We must travel down into the quiet meeting rooms of the building management entity. We must look at the digital spreadsheets tracking the service charge accounts and the reserve funds. When a tower requires massive restorative work, the financial responsibility must be clearly mapped. The map includes the individual apartment owners and the appointed management entities. It includes the owners' committee and the original developers, and it includes the powerful regulatory authorities governing the real estate market. Under Dubai Law No. 6 of 2019, the rules of financial obligation are very specific. The law mandates that owners must pay annual service charges to maintain the jointly owned real property. These charges cover the management and the operation and the maintenance of the common parts. Crucially, the law explicitly defines the external facade as a common part of the building. These service charges must be strictly reviewed and officially approved by the regulatory authority. A portion of these collected fees must be deposited into a dedicated reserve fund. This reserve fund is meant to act as a financial oxygen tank for emergencies and major equipment replacements. But a major crisis emerges when a building discovers that its reserve fund is completely inadequate. If the reserve fund cannot cover the cost of massive exterior repairs, the law provides a mechanism. The regulatory authority can approve a request to demand additional financial contributions directly from the unit owners. This is where the physical aging of the building collides violently with macroeconomic reality. Many investors purchase these units strictly to generate revenue through short-term tourism rentals. They rely on a steady flow of international visitors to cover their mortgages and their annual service fees. But the tourism market is heavily exposed to regional instability and fluctuating global economic pressures. When geopolitical tensions rise, or when seasonal demand drops the hotel and short-term rental occupancies fall, the massive influx of new real estate projects creates an oversupply that forces landlords to lower their daily rates. Their expected tourism yields shrink precisely when the building management issues a demand for emergency repair funds. The owner looks at their dwindling rental income and looks at the massive unexpected invoice. They argue that they only own the internal space of their specific apartment. They argue that the failing facade is a construction defect that the original developer should pay for. But identifying liability after a decade or more is an incredibly complex legal battle. Is the failing seal a design defect, or a construction failure, or simply normal material aging? The argument over who should pay causes the necessary maintenance to be delayed even further. But time does not care about arguments over cash flow or declining tourism yields. And in the near future, the city will place a strict legal deadline on this exact aging process. The arguments in the management office are about to be interrupted by a very hard deadline. Dubai Law No. 3 of 2026, concerning the quality and safety of buildings, changes everything. This legislation introduces a mandatory mechanism that forces buildings to prove their structural integrity. It requires owners to obtain an official quality and safety certificate once the building reaches 20 years of age. This is a massive pivot from a system of reactive maintenance to a system of proactive legal enforcement. The assessment required to obtain this certificate is not a simple visual inspection. It demands a rigorous evaluation of the entire structural framework of the tower. It specifically mandates the inspection of all exterior cladding and exterior facade systems. It includes all external electrical and mechanical equipment installed in the common areas. It requires a deep analysis of all windows and doors and balcony barriers across the entire vertical surface. The process operates like a ticking clock. Specialized engineers must conduct the physical inspections and generate a detailed technical report. This report must clearly identify any technical defects compromising the safety or integrity of the structure. The report must also propose the specific engineering solutions required to rectify these faults. Once the authorities review the report, they will impose a strict time limit for the building to complete the repairs. The management must hire approved contractors to execute the heavy maintenance. After the work is completed, the building must undergo another round of inspections. Only then can the official safety certificate be issued to the property. The law even contains provisions for extreme scenarios where massive structural intervention is required. If the required repairs demand that the building be emptied for the contractors to work safely, the law outlines the process. It establishes the legal obligation to take the necessary actions to evacuate the occupants. This does not mean every 20-year-old building will be suddenly evacuated. It simply means the legal framework now explicitly recognizes temporary displacement as a valid consequence of severe maintenance debt. Once obtained, the safety certificate is valid for 10 years for buildings under 40 years old. It is valid for 5 years for buildings that have passed the 40-year mark. This creates a fascinating contrast with the original marketing narrative. Property developers sell these units as lifetime investments meant to hold their value forever. But the regulatory authorities evaluate these same structures using a much shorter calendar. The tower might have been advertised as a timeless masterpiece of modern engineering, but the engineers conducting the inspections still measure its lifespan in decades. When the physical decay of the facade meets the strict legal deadlines, a perfect storm begins to form. This storm consists of three devastating elements colliding at the exact same time. First, the technical report confirms that the building requires massive and expensive exterior interventions. Second, the management discovers that the financial reserve fund is heavily depleted and insufficient. Third, the building is legally mandated to complete the repairs within a specific regulatory timeframe. If the owners fail to comply, they are walking into a trap with two separate legal jaws. The first jaw of the trap is the penalty for failing to secure the safety certificate. The 2026 law establishes a framework for penalizing non-compliance. Violations of the law or its executive resolutions can attract significant financial penalties. The law establishes a sliding scale of fines ranging from 100 dirhams up to 1 million dirhams. The specific fine depends heavily on the exact nature of the violation and the severity of the circumstances. It does not mean every leaky window results in a maximum penalty, but it establishes a firm boundary that building safety is no longer optional. The second jaw of the trap is the mechanism for collecting unpaid service charges. When the management demands emergency funds to fix the facade, some owners will inevitably refuse to pay. Their refusal might stem from dropping tourism revenues or simply a lack of personal liquidity. But Dubai Law No. 6 of 2019 provides the management with aggressive collection tools. The management entity holds a legal lien over the apartment for any unpaid service charges. The owner cannot sell or transfer the ownership of their unit until the outstanding debt is cleared. If the owner continues to ignore the financial demands, the management can escalate the situation. They can follow a strict legal procedure to issue formal notifications through a notary public. If the debt remains unsettled, a judge can intervene. The execution judge has the authority to order the apartment to be sold at public auction. The proceeds from this auction are used to recover the unpaid service charges meant to fix the building. A dried piece of rubber sealant does not automatically cause an apartment to be auctioned off, but it acts as the first domino in a brutal chain of legal and financial obligations. It starts with an inspection and moves to a massive repair bill and escalated service charges. It progresses to official demands for emergency funds and ends with aggressive legal enforcement. Buyers believed they were simply purchasing a private sanctuary floating high above the clouds. But the legal documents prove they also purchased a fraction of every aging joint on the exterior walls. To truly understand the gravity of this situation, we must zoom out from the single apartment. We must look at the entire urban ecosystem as hundreds of massive structures enter their mature phase. Dubai has built its economic miracle on a narrative of relentless forward momentum. It relies heavily on setting global records and attracting millions of international tourists every year. The influx of short-term visitors helps mask the underlying costs of maintaining this hyper-modern infrastructure. When hotels are full and rental yields are high, the massive service charges feel like an acceptable cost of doing business. But a city heavily exposed to the fluctuations of global aviation and regional tourism is inherently vulnerable. When macroeconomic pressures arrive, the calculation changes immediately. If regional instability causes a sudden dip in international arrivals, the rental revenues begin to shrink. At the exact same time, the 20-year aging cycle of the early building boom begins to mature. The income generated by the property drops precisely when the maintenance debt comes due. This creates a profound shift in how intelligent investors must evaluate the real estate market. The era of buying a property based purely on the view and the marketing brochure is over. A buyer with a life cycle mindset must now investigate the hidden history of the building. They must demand to see the historical maintenance logs and the most recent facade inspection reports. They must scrutinize the approved service charge index and verify the actual health of the reserve fund. They must ask if there are any major restorative works pending or any active disputes among the owners' committee. They must calculate whether the potential tourism yields can truly outpace the inevitable cost of aging materials. An uninformed buyer asks what direction the living room window faces. An informed buyer asks what year the weather sealant around that window was last replaced. The transition of a city from a construction site to a mature metropolis is financially painful. You are not just buying a luxury apartment with premium amenities, you are buying a proportional share in the mandatory upkeep of a massive vertical machine. And when that machine operates in an environment with shifting tourism demands, the financial risk multiplies. We return to the quiet living room on the 60th floor in the middle of the night. The drop of water has been wiped away, but the structural reality remains exactly the same. Outside the glass, a mechanical gondola hangs silently in the darkness. Technicians with heavy harnesses and bright flashlights are meticulously inspecting the silicone joints. There is no dramatic collapse, and there is no sudden explosion of shattered glass. The lights inside the surrounding apartments are still glowing warmly against the night sky. The city continues to operate exactly as it was designed to operate. Dubai built these magnificent towers to reflect the beauty of the sky and the ambition of the future. But as these towers mature, they begin to reflect something entirely different. They reflect the massive cumulative invoices that their sheer beauty has successfully hidden for decades. Nature does not need to shatter the glass to compromise the integrity of the structure. Time does not need to tilt the foundation to place the owners under immense pressure. They only need to continually degrade the tiny synthetic joints holding the illusion together. They only need to bring the mandatory inspections closer and make the financial reserves smaller. A modern city does not necessarily fail with a loud and spectacular noise. Sometimes it just stands perfectly still and receives the bill. If this documentary made you look at a glowing skyline differently, please consider subscribing to the channel. Because behind every beautiful architectural symbol, there is always a complex system that must be paid for to keep it standing. This video is for analytical and educational purposes only and does not constitute financial or legal advice. This content analyzes systemic engineering and regulatory mechanisms and does not conclude that all glass structures in Dubai are unsafe.